So you're saying that caffeine is interfering with our neurons. If so, what is it doing? Thank you very much for the question. Let's get to it. Caffeine, its primary mechanism of action is it's an adenosine receptor antagonist. Well, then what's adenosine? I'm sure we've all heard through grade school biology about ATP, adenosine triphosphate. All the cells in our body use ATP to harness energy through the breaking of those phosphate bonds, triphosphate 3 bonds, in order to power cellular processes. The brain cells are no different. Neurons, glial cells, an example of a glial cell is an astrocyte. They use ATP. One way in which adenosine can build up in the brain is through what's called gliotransmission. Right? That is when ATP is released from glial cells. As I said, example of that is astrocytes. It can help augment the communication between neurons, right? Trying to keep this simple. And that ATP can eventually be broken down by enzymes into, ultimately, adenosine, and then even into inosine as adenosine can get broken down. Well, there are receptors, and I'm just going to be talking about in the brain here. There are receptors in the brain for adenosine. Now, there are 4 receptors in total in our body for adenosine. There's the A1, the A2A, the A2B, and the A3. The ones in the brain are going to be the A1 and the A2A, or at least the majority of the adenosine receptors, to my knowledge, are going to be the A1 and the A2A. Those are the 2 receptors that caffeine is an antagonist for. So we're going to go into a little bit about what those receptors do, and then we'll understand what caffeine does to antagonize those. So the A1 receptor is essentially, it causes an inhibitory response, meaning when adenosine binds to it, it causes neuron activity to slow down. One way it does that is it inhibits, or at least it reduces the activity of voltage-gated calcium channels, all right? As the name implies, voltage gated. So they're gated, so it's like shut, and then dependent upon the voltage, that depends on if that gate opens up or not. And then a calcium channel, it allows in calcium. And when that calcium comes in, that then facilitates the release of neurotransmitters. I'm sure we've all heard of like dopamine, etc. So it could also include glutamate. That's an excitatory neurotransmitter. Well, when adenosine attaches to that A1 receptor, it inhibits or reduces the activity of voltage-gated calcium channels. So you're reducing the amount of neurotransmitters that are released. So that's one way in which adenosine can help to slow neuron activity. Well, the A2A receptor is stimulatory. Now you may think stimulatory, like, okay, wait a second, it's supposed to be inhibiting. Well, it can ultimately stimulate the release of GABA. GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. So it's stimulatory to increase the release of a neurotransmitter, but that neurotransmitter ultimately causes neuron activity to reduce, to decrease. So those are kind of 2 ways, keeping it kind of brief, that adenosine can impact neuron activity and slow it down. And then that causes us to kind of get tired and want to go to sleep. So caffeine is an antagonist to those receptors. So caffeine, I'll put up the picture of the 2 molecules here, caffeine and adenosine. They're similar in chemical structure, but they're not quite the same. So caffeine can bind to those adenosine receptors, the A1 and the A2A, but since it's not the right chemical shape, it can't activate the receptors. So it doesn't cause the inhibition of the voltage-gated calcium channels. It doesn't cause the increase in the release of GABA. So think of it as like if, I guess now everybody has the automatic locks, but back in the day when you have to go and have to physically unlock the car. I remember my uncle, not my uncle, my brother would drive a 1978 Dodge Dart. We called it the Dodge Fart. It was like a baby blue color. I probably couldn't even get to 40 miles an hour in terms of speed, but it started every single time. But, you had to use the physical locking to manually roll down the windows and everything. A lot of memories from that car. But think of it that way. It's like you have a key and you put the lock in, and then you can lock or unlock the car door. But if you have a key that fits in, but it's not the right shape, it may fit all the way into the lock, but you can't lock it or unlock. It's like, oh, it's the wrong key. That's kind of like caffeine and adenosine to the receptors being the lock, and then adenosine being the right key, caffeine being the wrong key. It fits, but it doesn't activate it. So in that way, right, caffeine is preventing the onset of fatigue. Now, caffeine can cause euphoria, essentially like a euphoric feeling, because these adenosine receptors are tied to dopamine receptors, meaning that the activation of one inhibits the response of the other, and vice versa. All right. So by inhibiting those adenosine receptors, you could be increasing the action that dopamine receptors have. So that can actually be causing us to have that euphoric feeling, the dopamine hit. All right. So the danger comes in with caffeine is when you are taking it too much and then too long, essentially. Now, when you first start taking caffeine, you're very sensitive to it. If you haven't taken caffeine before, or if you haven't taken it for a while, and then your body's become sensitive to it again, if you take not very much of it, you can get that effect, that wakefulness feeling, the euphoric feeling. But in a pretty short amount of time, you build a tolerance to it. All right. Your body has ways to try to counteract the effect of caffeine. So the issue comes with that if you're taking caffeine and then, possibly maybe you take it and maybe too close to bedtime, let's say, and that could be hours before you go to sleep because caffeine has a long half-life, right? Depending on the person, but usually it's like 4 hours is the half-life. If you take it too close to when it's time to go to bed, then it could impact negatively your sleep. And then what happens is, because it impacted your sleep in a negative way, the next day you're tired. So what do we do as humans? I'm tired. I need caffeine. And so you take caffeine again. And then now all of a sudden you're getting into this horrible loop where just to wake up in the morning because your sleep is affected, you need caffeine to wake you up. But yet that caffeine is affecting your sleep at night, and then you're getting into this vicious cycle to where just to function, you need your caffeine. I'm sure you've ever said, don't talk to me before my morning cup of coffee, those types of jokes stuff. That's somebody who really needs to take a break from caffeine for a while. So it's in short to answer your question, yes, it does interfere with neuron activity. So I hope that answers it. I hope that helps. Thanks so much for listening and or watching. And until next time, like, subscribe, follow, share, whatever it is. Ask questions. I'm always happy to help. Take care, folks. Adios.